transparency? What is that technology that ensures that this data collaboration happens in a privacy compliant manner, in such that this data collaboration does not enable any entity to be able to take advantage of the data of the others?
Welcome to the Agile Digital Transformation Podcast, where we explore different aspects of digital transformation and digital experience with your host, Tim Butera, Content and Community Manager at AgileDrop.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Our guest today is Prateek Dayal, Chief Strategy Officer at Aqilliz, a blockchain solutions provider whose aim is to make privacy a key element of digital marketing. Aqilliz is a first-of-its-kind technological infrastructure built with privacy compliance top of mind. Rooted in the pillars of unification, discovery, and engagement, Aqilliz delivers solutions which ensure that brands abide by relevant regulatory frameworks when engaging with their consumers, effectively protecting corporate regulations and boosting marketing ROI. With privacy awareness on the rise even among the less tech-savvy consumers, it's high time that digital transformation initiatives embrace privacy, and this is what we'll be focusing on in today's episode. So, why digital transformation cannot succeed without making data privacy a top priority. And welcome, Prateek. Thank you so much for being our guest today. Can you start off by telling us what was the situation with data privacy in the early days of the internet, and how did privacy awareness evolve alongside technology innovations?
Excellent. First and foremost, thanks for having me on, Tim. Pleasure to be here with you. With respect to your question, wow, we're going a few years back, right? So I think when you speak about privacy and the internet, if memory serves me correctly, we're going all the way back to 1994, when the first browser cookies were introduced. And of course, cookies became the kind of default mechanism over time through which people's activities were tracked over the internet. And of course, as the internet exploded over the last few decades, there's been an explosion in the kind of data, customer data that is out there on the net, doing all sorts of things, and which is essentially given rise to, so there's a scale of data. And now, as you say, there's been a lot of discussions about how this data is being used, firstly. So in the initial years of the internet, 90s, late 90s, and, early 2000s, basically, nobody really knew what a cookie was, frankly, right? But now, as the volume of data is exploded, people are asking two things. One, the ethics behind it. How is my data being used? What is it being used for? Is it being used for with my knowledge or not? So the whole ethical part of it. And the second part of it is also the technology of it, right? The technology has also exploded. The technology that captures this data, that processes this data, and so on and so forth. Is that stable? Is that secure? And as you'd be aware, there have been so many other instances where, whether it be the ethical use of data, whether it be the Cambridge Analytica scandal, for example, or so many other instances of hacks and, cyber attacks and whatnot, etc. So all this has kind of really picked up steam, leading to the regulators basically sitting up and taking notice of it to say, right, here is this business, basically the business of capture and processing of customer data, and now we need to regulate it. So therefore, the regulators came in, starting off with GDPR in the EU, right, and then CCPA in California, and so on and so forth, that have basically, as you would be aware, right, have introduced legislation trying to kind of regulate some of these issues surrounding data. In our part of the world, in Asia, of course, right through from China to India to us here in Singapore, we have or are introducing legislation that looks to achieve something very similar to CCPA and GDPR. So that's, in a nutshell, what started off as a plain simple cookie back in the mid 90s exploded into this multi-million-dollar business, which raised questions about ethical use of data and the technology, which made the regulators sit up and try to regulate it. So it's a very interesting journey so far, and it's still not over.
Yep, I still remember first hearing or encountering the word cookie when I was still a kid browsing the web, and I was like, okay, cookies, this is just some web speak, I guess, and I didn't really bother with it, until GDPR, the update to GDPR dropped in 2018. That's when I just started my first job, and I was tasked with updating some of the cookie policies and stuff like that. So ever since then, I've had a very, very keen understanding, and I've been very focused on privacy. Yeah,
that's right.
So, okay, then the COVID pandemic hit last year, and basically it affected every field within the digital. And would you say that COVID has had a huge impact on how we view and treat privacy as well? And if so, what kind of impact and why did it have such a huge impact?
No, absolutely. You're absolutely right. I mean, so much, if all the stuff that we talked about earlier wasn't enough, COVID
Mhm.
has served this purpose of kind of exacerbating these discussions around data use and so on and so forth, right? Primarily because of two reasons, I feel, in my view. One is a lot of us are staying at home, of course, and therefore there is just more data. There is more digital data interactions on the net. We are spending more time on the internet, simply put, right? So therefore, our data points that are being captured, being processed and tracked on the internet have just grown exponentially compared to pre-COVID times. So one, there is more volume of data. Plus, within COVID specifically, there have been a lot of issues that you'd be aware of is about this whole business of contact tracing. A lot of countries have introduced contact tracing, right? Using Bluetooth technology, physical devices, tokens, whatnot, all this sort of stuff, right? Which has made people just basically sit up and also get more conscious about the fact that our data is being used. So therefore, in this case, for contact tracing as an example, so therefore, I'd like to know how this is being used, who is using it, when does it get deleted, and so on and so forth. So explosion in kind of data points as a result of people sat at home. Second, COVID specific data issues, predominantly, contact tracing, have people even more aware than before of some of these specific issues surrounding data protection and privacy.
So we had kind of one thing that was a direct consequence of COVID. So the contact tracing, and one was an indirect consequence of COVID. So the bigger influx of data due to more of us spending time online and interacting online and buying stuff online, and just kind of these two playing together, both sides.
That's right.
And yeah, you mentioned GDPR and CCPA in California and other local updates to privacy regulations. And how do you think that relationships between brands and consumers, their customers, will evolve as new and updated regulations continue to get rolled out?
Yeah, that's right. And that's where the rubber really hits the road, because these brands, and not just brands, but also platforms, they have the customer relationship, right? So it's between them, and so they are the custodians. So the brands in that case are the custodians of customer data. They are the ones who are responsible for adhering to the various, regulations as well. So they obviously play a very critical role. The way I see it is that, there is a trust crisis. I mean, for example, as a consumer, as an individual, I read all this noise about data privacy and so on and so forth. Who do I really go to? Who do I trust to make sure my data is being used in the correct manner? Is my brand. I mean, the entity I gave my data to, or the platform, as the case may be. So therefore, I think the onus on the responsibility on brands has equally grown over time as we were charting out the course of data privacy, because they are at the forefront of, as I said, of making sure that they regain the trust of their customers, right? And also the fact that they are also at the forefront for ensuring that, all the various regulatory requirements are met. So in other words, Tim, I guess what I'm trying to say is brands are in the hot seat in making sure how customer data is used and is protected and is processed.
Yep, those are some very good points. It's with the rise of privacy awareness and the rise of this trend that consumers are more aware of brands' ethical and social responsibilities, and this kind of pairs up to make them even more conscious of how the brands that they love and that they follow and that they interact with, how they treat privacy. And it can be a deal breaker in this day and age, where with such a high focus on these things for brand reputation. One small mishap, as we saw with Cambridge Analytica, the trust in Facebook, I think, kind of really shook with that, and that's when we started seeing things roll. It was only a few months after that the updates to GDPR were introduced, and then things just snowballed after that with privacy, basically.
That's right. I mean, it takes so much effort and years, I guess, to build trust, to invest in your users, and it can just go away just like that.
Yeah, that was the best way of putting it. It takes years to do it, but it takes a second to ruin it, basically.
That's right.
So with all this in mind, with all that we've discussed so far in mind, how should digital transformation initiatives incorporate privacy as an essential element of their offering? What steps should businesses take as they digitalize more and more?
No, absolutely. And as I said, practitioners in digital transformation, right? Firstly, the awareness I see that this whole like managing the entire consumer data life cycle is a very core part of digital transformation. Firstly, that's something that needs to be on people's radars. And right through, when I say data life cycle, right through from data collection to obtaining consent to where it's kept, where it's housed, where it's stored, who's it, shared with, to what effect, and all of that, the entire life cycle, I see that as being a core, capability that the digital transformation folks, should be able to kind of own and to be able to outline specifically within the steps. So some of the things, and there are many aspects to this, right? But I want to outline a few based on my experiences. Firstly, how, for example, if in the digital team, right, if we are onboarding vendors, right, and there is some data exchange involved, the first piece here is to say, right, how whenever the data leaves my organization, how is it being processed, right? I need to have full transparency of that, right? I want have a data privacy assessment of my vendors, okay, which needs to be a kind of checklist of all the things that they should be doing, which would make me comfortable, engage with them, right? I would also want to look at data processing agreements, right? So literally the legalese around it, okay, with vendors and with my partners to say, what are the regulatory obligation, who's responsible for what, and so on and so forth. So that's the second piece, the legalese around my data privacy agreements with vendors and third parties. Also the bit about scenario analysis, right? So impact assessment when you're processing data. So stuff like, for example, a core part of the job, I also feel, Tim, is volume and velocity of data, right? So we need to game a few scenarios where is to say, right, suddenly there is an uptick in data processing volumes, which is much more than what we forecasted internally. How are we going to deal with it, right? Where does it go? Do systems kind of fall over, right? If not, what is the backup? Because from a customer perspective, they're used to seamless experience, right? So what are those processes and capabilities in place that make sure that even in various scenarios with respect to volume and velocity of data, both internal and external, how do you ensure seamless, smooth experience, right? So that's the kind of impact assessment part. Last but not the least, right, at all, is the bit about transparency and clarity. And what I mean by this is, for example, consent management is obviously a very critical part of a brand or a platform's proposition, right? So therefore, do our consumers, do our users have complete simple English, understanding of what data is being collected and what is it going to be used for, and if that is going to be shared onwards, who will it be shared with? So it's the job of us in digital transformation to be able to ensure that these things are happening up to a standard that the regulators would be happy with, and that we as brands owning a relationship with our users would be able to delight them in that experience. So these are just some examples, but there are so many things, as I said, if you think about the data life cycle that end to end, digital transformation also captures.
I'm really glad you brought up transparency and clarity, because this, I think, is one of the factors that I still see a lot of firms get wrong, even with something as basic as the cookie consent banners on their website, where it's very often it's a trend that you're not really given the option to opt in or opt out. It's just auto opt in with as little information as possible. And I think that even something as basic as that should change, even for industries and companies that don't necessarily make heavy use of the data that you give them, or that collect huge amounts of data. But in a similar line, you mentioned the volume or the bigger volume of data now, but maybe on the other end of the spectrum, since we're also seeing a lot of not regulations, but a lot of tech innovation that's aiming to limit the use, the reliance on cookies and stuff like that. How would you say that this will impact stuff, and how should brands go forward with what kind of data they collect and how much data they collect, basically?
No, absolutely. And you'd be aware, Tim, that the advertising industry is going through a seismic change as we speak, specifically what with respect to the use of third-party cookies. So you'd be aware that the biggest, three browsers are phasing out third-party cookies, which, as we discussed earlier, has become the default mechanism of tracking people's behavior, online, right? And that has been phased out and will continue to be phased out, and so on. So basically, you have a situation where the industry is basically thinking, right, what replaces the cookie, all right? And so therefore, we're increasingly moving to a world where, brands and platforms, basically data owners, will have to collaborate with each other, right? To be able to get a better understanding of their users, to be able to collaborate on data, build a more granular understanding of you as the user, and so on and so forth. All these things that you used to be able to do, which then comes to the question about, again, transparency. What is that technology that ensures that this data collaboration happens in a privacy compliant manner, in such that this data collaboration does not enable any entity to be able to take advantage of the data of the others, right? So therefore, some of the technologies, and then back to your point about, at the end of the day, then the user needs to have complete transparency. So some of the kind of technologies, and these are some things that we are also building, products on, is stuff like, for example, data clean rooms, federated learning, right, where data owners, data belonging to two different owners is never centralized in one place. It continues to be located in their own respective servers. And through federated learning technology, you're able to, for example, create audiences and talk to these kind of distributed databases. So that's one kind of technology that is, I see that on the rise. Blockchain is another one. You referred to blockchain, right? I think it's a very critical piece in delivering that transparency to the users, because it's one thing taking consent from people in, hopefully in simple English, to say how your data is being used, but it's entirely another to actually give them evidence of the fact that whether did you use the data in that manner or not, right? And that is not only transparency, not just for users only, but also for regulators. So blockchain, another, to your point about emerging technologies, is yet another a very good technology to record the customer life cycle. How exactly was customer data used once consent was taken? This, as I said, is a very critical piece, I believe, in giving regulators, meeting your regulatory obligations, and being able to go back to your users to say, this is how I use your data, and here is the evidence for this. So federated learning, differential privacy, blockchain for transparency, as you rightly said, these are some specific examples of emerging technologies that solve for some of these issues in the advertising world, at least when the cookie goes away.
Yeah, because marketing and advertising are industries where trust between the customer and the brand, or trust of customers in the brands that they support, is really, really key. And there has to be some extra steps taken here. And I really love the example of blockchain. I assume that this is also what Aqilliz brings to the table for your clients. So kind of incorporating and implementing these blockchain solutions.
That's right. There was a natural bias there. That's why I use that example as well, which is that's something that we do as well. Yes.
Well, but it makes obvious sense. You are kind of representing Aqilliz here, so it makes the most sense that you would at least mention what and how you do and how you help your clients, if it's relevant to what we're discussing today, right? And yeah, maybe to kind of change the topic a tiny bit, but still stay close to it. So one of the less often discussed consequences of COVID and the pandemic and this influx of digital usage is also the increased volume and efficiency of cyber attacks. Are there any privacy-related steps that companies can take that will also boost their cybersecurity?
No, true. And as you rightly said, with more data points, there are more data points to attack, as you said. So a very critical issue that you raise. And I think some of the things, again, when you talk about cybersecurity is, again, and there's a plethora of solutions here, but some of the important ones that come to mind is, for example, multi-factor authentication, and that is something that I think most of us are dealing with as we work from home, etc. Right? So to be able to identify yourself as an employee, logging in to your company systems, for example, through multi-factor authentication, basically, as opposed to single factor, right? So that's, I see that a lot of uptake of that, right? Stuff like, for example, virtual private networks, endpoint protection, cloud interfaces. Again, I'm throwing a bit of a few kind of jargon in here, so apologies for that. But again, a lot of these I see as being used not only by us, for example, as a company, but in the clients we serve. Okay, so there's a lot of that. Also, it's also about system updates. So we as a company ensure that all our critical kind of systems are all up and running. There are frequent updates. There are backups. For example, if you're running a blockchain node, servers running your nodes, they need to be up and running all the time, etc. Right? So what is the kind of backup? How do you make sure that they are up and running all the time, and so on and so forth? So that's very important. Last but not the least, I would say, Tim, is on this particular point, it's just education as well. And I'm speaking from my experience, Ryan. I used to hear the word cybersecurity, but not really know what it meant, right? And it was really helpful to be educated on that your data, what it means to you, right? So somebody could pose as being Prateek logging into the company system. So that's one example. And this is how you prevent that. Similarly, now from an employee perspective, think about what cybersecurity could mean. Somebody could hack into your company system. So therefore, what is the resolution for that? So I think it was just what I found was very helpful in people just setting out what cybersecurity meant and what it means to me in my daily life, in my daily kind of professional life, and what should I do to prevent, how can I play a part in preventing cybersecurity attacks?
This last point is absolutely crucial, I think, Prateek. As with most initiatives and fields within digital transformation, the getting your people on board is essential to success with anything, basically, whether it be new ways of learning, a new technology, automation, or in our case, privacy. It has to be done with the people in mind, and it has to be done not just it mustn't only be a technology change, but it also have to be a kind of a mindset shift, right? In order to get people to really, as you said, to really see the potential consequences of not following these regulations, and not only the consequences for them, but for the entire business, basically.
Absolutely. Well said.
Awesome. Before we wrap up the call, do you maybe have any top words of advice for business owners and decision makers that maybe are having trouble implementing privacy, or maybe even more importantly, are having trouble achieving this shift in mindset on an organizational scale?
What I would say is, the only advice I could offer is to keep a long-term view. I see a lot of knee-jerk reaction. GDPR is here. What are we going to do? What does it mean, right? But I would urge most practitioners, people in the industry, to take a longer-term view. And the reason why I say this is, for example, again, back to the industry that I am in advertising and in marketing, right? There are many things happening at the same time, right? For example, there is regulation, there is cookies, right? There is cybersecurity, there are other things, right? So rather than us reacting to each of these individually, if I were to take a slightly longer term or medium term view of my business, right? Where do I want to be, right? Where do I want to be such that I am in a post-cookie world? Where do I want to be if I want to be regulatory compliant and all this sort of stuff? And therefore, what is the roadmap that will take me there? So I guess in summary, Tim, it's about just taking a longer term macro view with everything, so many moving parts, but having a vision of where you want to move the business to with respect to data privacy, and then work your way back in terms of how do I deliver each of these elements.
Awesome. That's definitely a key point of advice, and one I think that listeners will also greatly benefit from. Thank you so much, Prateek. Before we wrap up the call, if our listeners want to reach out to you or learn even more about you, what's the best way for them to reach you?
Simply, please reach out to me on LinkedIn, Prateek Dayal. You'll find me there. Yeah, and if there's any small way in which I can be of any help, do feel free to reach out. More than happy to.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Prateek, for a very insightful conversation. I really enjoyed it. It's been a real pleasure talking to you today.
Likewise, Tim. Thank you for having me.
Well, to our listeners, that's all for this episode. Have a great day, everyone, and stay safe.
Thanks for tuning in. If you'd like to check out our other episodes, you can find all of them at agiledrop.com/podcast, as well as on all the most popular podcasting platforms. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any new episodes, and don't forget to share the podcast with your friends and colleagues.